This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
So welcome to this quick edition of Where Did the Road Go? And I am here with Michael Hughes. Hello, Mike.
Great to be here. Great to be here as always, Soraya.
And I wanted to have you on, on Sunday, but it wasn't something we could work out because I wanted to get your viewpoint on this whole disclosure New York Times article thing, because it's different, I think, from the majority of the people on Where Did the Road Go, and I wanted that to be represented. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you think of all this that's been going down?
Yeah, well, I unfortunately I didn't hear your discussion, but I have seen some, posts and tweets from Red Pill Junkie and from Josh and from yourself. So I think I have a, kind of a general idea of where you guys are coming from and maybe how I see things a little bit different. I see what happened particularly with the news media, particularly with the normally staid conservative, won't go near a UFO story with the 10-foot pole media like the paper of record, the New York Times, the Washington Post, who really initiated this story and got the ball rolling. I was kind of shocked, and I was shocked because you just don't see that kind of reporting, that kind of objective reporting about UFOs, without snarkiness, without dismissal. These stories essentially reported factually, very concretely, that they're about this, this apparently discontinued program at the Pentagon. Elizondo, who quit to, go with the To the Stars thing with Tom DeLonge. I found this extraordinary, and whatever you think of the actual, like the fighter camera footage that was, or a couple different clips that were released, whatever you think of that, we could put that aside. Just the fact that the New York Times, the Washington Post covered this story and covered it in a way that is just not done by the most mainstream of mainstream media. That in itself is extraordinary. When it really sunk in, I was just kind of a little in shock about all of this. And I know there's been a lot of sort of, shrugging and, it's nothing among a lot of the UFO community. But I took my mom to the doctor. And as we were pulling up to the doctor's office, NPR came on, and NPR, a program called On Point, was doing a story on this new UFO stuff. And I said, sorry, Mom, I'm going to drop you off. I'm going to stay in the car. I really want to listen to this. And I sat and listened to the full, just about an hour of the program. And the tone of the anchor, there was zero snarkiness, mockery, derision, sneering, jokiness, the so-called laughter curtain that always accompanies UFO stories. It was just not there. And that, I remember sitting there. So they talked to Leslie Kean, who, presented herself well, like she always does. But then they even had like someone who had written a book about sort of the folkloric cultural aspects of UFOs and UFO stories and abductions and encounters and all that stuff. And they had this person on, you know, a daytime NPR call-in show, and there was zero ridicule. There was zero of which you always expect that knee-jerk. Well, I guess the little green man will be coming next, folks. Um, and it's extraordinary. I've been following UFOs in the media since I was a kid in the 1970s. I mean, I've been reading, everything I could get my hands on, but I've always paid particular attention to how the subject is handled in the media. And there hasn't been anything like this. I sent an email to Jerome Clark and said, Jerry, man, what do you think of this? And I can actually read the quote from his email because I thought it completely sort of reflected what I was thinking. He said, well, the simple answer is that I have no idea what will come of this, if anything. Still, it's the first sign of life for UFOs in respectable media since the early 1970s. As always, of course, no breath is being held in these quarters, but I wouldn't object if a reason came along to exhale. Now, the key point of that is that I mean, there's no one who has a more encyclopedic understanding of ufology than the guy who basically wrote the UFO encyclopedia. Um, and he's saying exactly what I was saying and what I was thinking. There is the change in tone in the mainstream, or what he calls respectable media, um, has not been seen since the 1970s. There have been occasions where they've taken things a little more seriously. I'm sure the Phoenix Lights was probably mentioned in the Post and the Times, things like that. But never anything with this sort of objectivity, the kind of objectivity that we just don't expect anymore, particularly from the mainstream media. And once this story came out in the Times, I mean, when something comes out in the Times, it's kind of legitimized. Now, granted, you always have to examine all media, very skeptically. But one thing and there are obvious examples of the Times, parroting propaganda, like the lead up to the Gulf War about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction and all that sort of thing. Right. Judith Miller completely, concocted all sorts of nonsense, and that led, to us being engaged in a war that we are still, very deeply, part of. And so you have to be careful. But the one thing the Times does is it gives a veneer of respectability that other journalistic organizations try to emulate. They have very stringent fact checking, very strong journalistic code for when you're publishing something. You want to make damn sure that you have a lot of support behind it. And so what I saw with this is delegitimizing in the so-called paper of record, and it quickly fanned out into Time Magazine and Fox and NBC and MSNBC. Everyone picked up on this. The UK media and ran with it, and ran with it with exactly the same lack of the usual debunker garbage, and ran with it as if this is real. This phenomenon is real. So regardless of what you think of the To the Stars Academy and their fundraising appeal, and whatever you think of, well, the government, where these videos came from, this is a really it's an incredible moment. And even if nothing comes out of it, if this is just it, this is still a moment that will be remembered in ufology as sort of a game-changing moment. Now, granted, the coverage could go right back to where it was before. This could just be a blip. It could be, just a rare eruption of objectivity and sanity. But I really think something is going on below the surface. And what's going on below the surface is that, from what I think, is that the mainstream media was given some information that was convincing enough, that was supported enough by facts, by some background information, by important people. Someone like Harry Reid, former senator, coming out and endorsing this. Um, it's big news. So no matter what you think about the actual content, the change in focus, the change in tone is really remarkable, and that's what makes me think that perhaps there's something going on underneath the surface that allowed this to happen, and that perhaps this is the beginning of something.
So I don't necessarily disagree with what you said there. I don't think it was anything revolutionary as far as what they announced, but you're right. The media did change its tone for once,
Mm-hmm.
but not 100%. Like the Daily News, December 17th, they have a picture of E.T. and the Men in Black on the cover, and it says, "Ouch! Feds spend $22 million a year on Harry Reid's secret alien search." So it wasn't quite universal. There were some detractors, but you also got to figure that all these news groups are basically like four companies, and they
Yeah, yeah.
literally parrot what the other ones they're told this is what you're going to announce, and that's what they announce to all these different venues. So it's not like they had to win over everyone independently. There's not really a lot of independent journalism out there.
No, no, that's not correct. There is quite a bit of independent
Well,
journalism.
not in the big groups.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, but the thing is, there is quite a bit. Let's just address your first point. Yeah,
Okay.
sure. There were a handful of news outlets that that took a little bit of a different slant on this, or threw some funny stuff in there. But for the most part, and I get Google alerts for the word UFO,
Mm.
and so I comb through these pretty. I get them. There's something every day somewhere that comes through about UFOs. But if you look at this quantitatively, if you look at the tone, in again, what Jerry Clark said it's the respectable media. These are the media that people, for better or for worse, put the most confidence in. So it doesn't matter if there's, and yes, I mean, many of these papers are controlled by conglomerates, and they are sort of satellites of larger conglomerates, and a lot of them kind of just, syndicate their news.
Yeah.
But the news that was done, um, but when something this like this comes out, the Times sort of led the pack, obviously, but there was something very, very different about this. And I realize a lot of people who have been in ufology for a long time, um, you know, we we know about all this stuff, right? I mean, we know there have been countless um, sightings by pilots, um, but a lot of people don't, and that kind of material never ever since the 1970s has come out in these respectable quote media organizations. So I disagree. I've looked at this very carefully. I've looked through scores of these articles, and there is a dramatic change in the vast majority of stories and the way that this was handled. Something has changed. It's unequivocal. Now, what that is, or who's doing it, or why they're doing it, um, I don't know. but I absolutely think it's unequivocal that there has been a sea change in the way the subject is being covered in the quote again respectable media. Something has changed.
Hmm. I I guess one of the things. I mean, that's not to say that's not true. Yes, it definitely has changed in the way they're dealing with this. Whether or not that stays the same, though, I don't necessarily have a lot of faith. I think all it's going to take is one goofy UFO story or the Pentagon to say that yeah, there's nothing to this, and they're going to go back to ridiculing it. But because you figure none of this came from official sources, it all came from ex senator, ex CIA people, ex DOD people, and none of it came from active people for one
Yeah,
reason or
but
another.
there's people. But the thing is, I mean, so what? I mean, these people are. Yeah. So Harry Reid is an ex senator, but he was a senator. He was a powerful senator in the United States
Oh
Congress.
yeah, absolutely.
So, and you have to understand too that sometimes the fact that someone is out of the official loop, so to speak, gives them a little more freedom to talk about things that Harry Reid's not running for elections anymore. So he can say these things and he doesn't have to worry it's going to affect him as far, as elections go. So, and this information, some of it is actually official. I mean, the video that Elizondo got, he had to get permission to release. The government just doesn't leave footage of anomalous objects lying around for some guy to pick up and walk out of his office and start spreading it around. And if you look at Greg Taylor's excellent article on this whole situation, I guess we could call it, you'll see that Greg um, he said he tried to look at where the video came from, and it had been online in the past,
Yeah.
but apparently the group that was hosting it was told to take it down by some government people. At least that's their story. So this was government footage. It was released. How it got released, how Elizondo got a hold of it, I don't know. I don't think any of us know.
I I,
But
I
but
think
but but footage from aircraft of anomalous objects doing crazy things with pilots freaking out as they're watching it just does not walk out of the Pentagon. Uh,
I think when it was published initially, there was no context for what we
mhm,
were looking at.
mhm. Well,
Um,
see, a lot of people are freaking out over if this is disclosure or not. Okay, I'd say it's maybe disclosure with a small d instead of a capital D. Um, because when we have someone like Harry Reid, who is basically coming out and saying, yes, this stuff is real. This program studied this phenomenon. It's real. We don't know what it is. And then you've got follow up by the Times about these, mysterious alloys that Bigelow has his hands on, his corporation. And again, this is, the New York Times doesn't do the kind of journalism that, Coast to Coast does. Like this is a story, I would expect to hear about unknown alloys and effects of UFOs on individuals, physical effects on people on Coast to Coast. And I think that's part of the problem why um, so many, people, ufologists, and so many UFO enthusiasts are kind of shrugging at this because we've heard it all before, and it's constantly recycled. But we've heard it through alternative channels, and there's a very big difference between hearing something like that on Coast to Coast, where you expect to hear something like that,
true.
where versus the front freaking page of the New York Times. There is a huge difference in that. So when we're talking about disclosure, another thing, what kind of is amusing to me is that a lot of people have talked for years and written about disclosure, and how it could happen, how it might happen, how they think it's going to happen. Richard Dolan even wrote an entire book about AD after disclosure, about how it can unfold, what would happen, that sort of thing. And what is happening right now with this sort of limited hangout leak, with a former senator saying, this stuff is real, and we've known about it for a long time, and the New York Times writing about it and not having a single word about that this is crazy, or the only person I've seen uh, you know get a lot of traction coming out against this so far is Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, I was watching him being interviewed on CNN, and he was it seemed to me like he was kind of struggling to deal with what had been presented. He kept saying, "Well, it's unknown," and he started going off on sort of humorous tangents and things like that, and like, well, tell me about it when when the aliens invite us to dinner, and again pushing that ridiculous non-argument that if it's not extra, insisting that if we're talking about UFOs, we're talking about extraterrestrials.
Right.
And that's the other interesting thing about some of the mainstream articles that came out in the quotes, where we don't know what this is. Now, Elizondo is, full ETH. It
Mm-hmm.
sounds like. But Harry Reid and others who were interviewed, said, we're really not sure what this is. And on the NPR show I was listening to, people were talking about multidimensional possibilities, and this, tangentially sort of touching on the Oz factor and all that stuff. So, I mean, however you look at it, the fact that this is the mainstream media saying there is a program that has existed, this program has evidence that's very compelling, that is impossible to explain what these things are, that there are high level government people involved, and ex government people involved, and corporate people involved. To me, I look back and I look at, well, how would disclosure work? This is exactly, I'm not saying that's what it is, but this is exactly how people said it could unfold, with a little bit leaking out, with with the mainstream sort of, putting this out there without criticism, and without, the instant debunker invited, into the conversation, to, some Phil class saying it's Jupiter, crap
Yeah.
like that. And, so this is precisely how people have talked about actual disclosure would unfold. Now, who knows if that's what it's meant to do, or if that's where it's going. But if I'm Joe, middle America, and I read the New York Times, and I think it's a fairly trustworthy paper, or the Washington Post, or the LA Chicago Tribune, whatever. And I'm seeing stories like this come out, and there's no, well, this really could just be, an inversion, or it could be birds, or, that sort of thing. This is being presented as, this is official. Officially, there are objects that do things that we can't understand. They interact with us. Our pilots have encountered them multiple times. That's not news to any of us. But the fact that it's presented as an official acknowledgement in the respectable media that Jerry Clark calls them, that's huge. This really, if it is being done intentionally, if there's sort of a memo, whether a literal memo, or whether it's just journalists being told, hey, we can approach this issue, we can talk about it without the ridicule, and we have important people who support this and have shown us solid evidence. That's big. I mean, that's disclosure with a little d. And like you said, it could all change on a dime. But I would find it really hard to imagine how this isn't going to sort of open, if nothing else, this isn't going to open sort of the floodgates for people to talk about their UFO sightings in a way that I think they were afraid to do before. And already today, I saw an article by the director Guillermo del Toro, Mexican director,
Hmm.
who talked about his UFO sighting. And he had never, as far as I know, he had never talked about that before. I think that's what this does, the legitimization uh, of of the phenomenon by the mainstream media, not the coast to coast, not the unknown country or anything like that, but the the most mainstream of mainstream media. I think that's going to change the tone of public discourse. We already see it. We see it when we see news programs where they're not just yucking at the end and bringing, throwing in the little green men sort of thing. It's changed. It has changed. Whether it's going to stay changed or not, something really changed.
Well, I think there's, in talking to Red Pill, for instance, he said that there's been very little coverage of it down in Mexico. And
Yeah.
also there was an article in the Washington Post that says the aliens are coming and no one cares. And
Hmm.
I saw it blip a few times on every time a new interview comes up, it'll blip on Facebook under trending and then just disappear.
Hmm.
I've talked to probably like 50 people since this came out. Now,
Yeah.
people who are not involved, not fans of Where Did the Road Go, or anything, people I'm dealing
Okay.
with who are customers or like into
Mm.
music or whatever, and I'll say, did you hear about the whole government UFO thing? And and every single one of them just looks at me blankly like, the what? One guy said, oh, I saw that in my feed. I thought it was fake news. And I was like, okay. But the article in the Washington Post, interestingly, basically said that no one's really all that shocked, and they're more concerned with all the mess that's going on in the world right now. And when
Mm.
you look at that, you got to wonder if the timing of this wasn't to distract from the fact that you had this tax plan pushed through, you had the FCC net neutrality removed, and all this other stuff that's going to hurt us in the long run.
Yeah, but
So
net,
let's
net
throw
neutrality.
out, yeah.
Yeah, net neutrality had already been, trashed
Oh yeah,
when
yeah.
this story came out. I understand the distraction idea, but like you said, if it was meant to be a distraction,
It didn't work.
well, it didn't work, and and I think the reaction of people should not be sort of how we decide whether the actual content itself is legitimate. I mean,
Oh,
I
sure, sure. I'm not
you
saying
know,
that.
yeah, but
I'm
but
saying that
but
people didn't notice in the way
mhm,
you would think they would have noticed if the government, like, I think if it came from the White House, people would have noticed more.
right. Well, haven't we talked about when we're theorizing about disclosure that more of a drip sort of thing than
It
a
could be.
than the president standing at the podium going, ladies and gentlemen, the aliens are here. I mean, I don't think anyone thinks that's the way it's going to unfold. And it's funny to me to see so many people in the UFO community just reacting so strongly and negatively to this. I don't see it really negatively or positively. I'm just kind of intrigued. And I think what we all need to do is just sort of try to step outside of ourselves and how we understand this stuff, and just think about what is actually happening. Just very you know just looking at what just factually looking at what is happening, and that is the mainstream media adopting and promoting the idea that UFOs are real.
Yes, and I agree that. I agree
Yeah.
totally with you on that. I just,
Mhm.
I would have thought it would have made a bigger impact on people, and it doesn't. It's like they didn't. It's not even that they didn't care. It's that a lot of them didn't even notice.
Yeah, well, we're all in our little bubbles and
True.
things like that. I mean, in my bubble, people were going crazy about it,
And and as far as UFO people, I've seen a pretty much a 50-50 split. Like people are either
Mhm.
super excited or they're just like, meh.
Yeah, yeah. And I for me, it felt surreal. It felt surreal, like this whole past year has felt very surreal. Like the simulation got injected with malware, and everything is going freaking nutso around us and falling apart and collapsing, and everything we believed in is doesn't make sense anymore, and things like that. um, so this when I was I had been reading those articles, and honestly I was in like a bit of shock, because I've always wondered, like, what's going to happen when this phenomenon is finally given the seriousness it deserves. And part of that, what gives it seriousness or keeps it from being taken seriously, is the way it's portrayed in the mainstream media, the stuff that people still look to be sort of like, if not always accurate, at least fact checked, and not just the rantings of some guy on YouTube or something.
Right.
And so I was in shock, and the significance of it, it took like a day for it to really sink in. And I had been reading those articles in the New York Times, and I'm just like waiting for the Phil Class moment, where they say, "Oh, this is all garbage," and they were just staring. That wasn't a flying tic tac. That was an inversion of the atmosphere, making Venus look like a tic tac or whatever. I mean, I was just waiting for it and reading these stories and not seeing that. Reading these stories and it's just, it was kind of mind boggling. And I don't think I understood it for the first day when this stuff was hitting. And I talked to other people, and my friends, and they kind of felt the same way. They're like, I really didn't like, I felt like we were all sort of in a bit of shock, because this doesn't happen. And then when I was sitting in that parking lot listening to the NPR radio show, and a woman's talking about like the cultural significance of alien encounters and such, like bringing on a folklorist to
Yeah.
talk
And
about
that's
this
really
stuff.
cool.
Yeah, I mean, and it did not happen. And that's when I sat back in the car and just like took a deep breath, and I'm like, wait a minute, man, something changed almost literally overnight. And regardless of how this eventually turns out, whether it turns out that this is some manufactured crap to get more money to the Stars Academy, or
Yeah.
um, I don't think it is, because I think the New York Times, the Washington Post, you know, Time, Newsweek, Fox, I mean, Fox generates a lot of fake news. So, but when you get all of these entities together, basically saying, okay, this is kind of real now, and we're going to treat it as if it's real, and we're going to lay off the ridicule, and we're going to lay off the mockery and the derision that has kept people from talking about this stuff openly. Man, I mean, that's when it hit me. Like, that's the big deal here. This is the moment, okay, that I really did not expect to see. As much as, people talk about what's going to happen when we really start taking this stuff seriously as a culture. And granted, this is a US centric perspective I'm talking about. Other
Yeah.
countries do take this seriously. But for the US, one of the major superpowers, where all of this subject has just been mercilessly marginalized and ridiculed in the scientific community and the media. um, Something flipped, a switch flipped, and now we're talking about it seriously. That's big. that's really big.
Okay. Um, and I guess when it comes to the actual data that's released, look, I don't have much of a doubt that the footage is legitimate. I know I've heard people
Hmm.
say it's CGI and stuff like that. I think it's legit footage. I mean, we know
Yeah.
they've spotted these things. Both civilian and military have spotted these things. It's picked up on radar, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. Yep.
Um, the we don't know what it is, obviously, and it
Right.
very well could be something that's ours that they want to see if anyone can figure that out. Like they may be releasing that to see, does Russia is it a cover for our own
Mm-hmm.
secret products, so projects, so that like people like Russia don't realize that we have this tech. It's not like it hasn't been done before.
Mm-hmm.
And also, as Greg pointed out, the people involved in this whole thing, at least one of them, I think, was involved in the aviary, which was a UFO disinformation group. So it's kind of like, as someone on Radio Mysterioso put it, it's kind of like being the ufologists are like the battered wife who keeps going back to the abusive husband because they say, no, 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 this time it's for real.
Well, that's certainly possible. I don't know what. Do you remember who this aviary individual was?
No, but in the last episode, Greg talks about it. I mean, that's
Okay.
his
Okay.
specialty was the aviary, and one of the people
Right.
in To the Stars and stuff was a part of the aviary, at least one.
Okay. Well, but there were also, I don't see the aviary as simply a disinformation factory. Several people that were rumored to be part of it, like Bruce Maccabee, for instance, who I've met a few times. He was doing great legitimate work. He had some screw ups possibly with the Gulf breeze, but he was always one of those interesting people who was actively in the military, but also out very openly talking about UFOs. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's always, of course, everything could be you know a disinformation ploy. I just don't see what the purpose of it of it being done like this would be. Um, someone would have to explain to me what what the point is. Now, if it is our technology, certainly, and we're just doing this to cover up stuff that we have flying around up there. That's a legitimate motive, I think. Um, but and I guess there's just no way to know that right now.
No, there's
If
not.
if
The other thing is we don't know how they think, like what their motives are, and I don't think these are the type of people who just say, "Let's give the people something." They always have an agenda. There's always something there. They're not just going to give anything away. So
well,
whatever their motive is, they're getting something out of it. It's not just good-natured information release.
well, that's possible also, but I don't think we can really know their motives. So I
No,
think ascribing sort of an ulterior, negative motive, assuming that this is just some ploy to get something. I'm not sure. I mean, you look at someone like John Podesta, who has been advocating for, opening up the government files, very
sure, sure.
openly, and another very, well-connected political person. I would ask. I mean, people who are kind of going under the assumption that this is all disinformation, that there's no realness to what, let's say, Harry Reid and Bigelow and all are trying to do. Um, I would say consider at least the possibility that there are people in power, you know, who are as interested in this stuff as we are, and that what's to prevent them. Government is not. People say the government, and
As if it's one
gov-
big thing.
right, government is lots of different people with lots of different agendas, and it's I think I see no reason to believe, and again, I haven't made any decisions about this, but I see no reason to assume that this is all like smoke and mirrors, or this has some sort of nefarious disinformation motives behind it. Why is it so hard to imagine that certain elements in our government, might think maybe it's time to talk about this stuff seriously instead of hiding it. We know they've been hiding it. We know they've been hiding it, since they first started noticing it. Those of us who are deep in this stuff and have studied it and have
Yeah.
looked at the documents that are available. So yeah, I mean, we need to consider all sorts of angles here about motives, about who's really behind it, who's pulling the strings, why now, all of that. All of that is up for discussion and should be discussed. But I don't think you know, we should assume anything at this point.
I,
I don't feel that, I don't feel like I can assume that it's disinformation. I don't think I can assume that it's legitimate disclosure with a small d or a capital D. But it's something's happening here, and I think we should be paying attention and not coming to premature conclusions about it.
I agree with that, and I just want to be clear. Like, for the information that was released here, I think pretty much all of that was probably legitimate. Like I said, it could be that we were looking at a test craft,
Hmm.
and it may have even been so. The pilot saw it and they went, "Can they figure out it's ours?" No.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, great. Now let's release it to this group a few years ago. Can they figure out it's ours? Nope. They think it's a real UFO. Okay,
Hmm.
but we
Sure.
don't know. I mean, it's just something that crossed my mind. But as
Hmm.
far as like Harry Reid giving
Hmm.
Bigelow money, I think that's all legitimate. I think that all happened. We
Hmm.
know Bigelow's been researching UFOs. It's only, when you think about it, it's only 4.4 million a year he gave him,
Hmm.
which to us is a lot of freaking money, but in
Yeah.
government standards, that's nothing. That's a penny to,
Hmm.
by comparison. Um, it's when it gets into the CIA guys, when it
Hmm.
gets into the DOD guys. I mean, there's always going to be good eggs in politics here and there,
Hmm.
but they're usually outnumbered by the I guess the ones who go along with the whole spiel, I guess you could say. Um, and you figure if you're in the CIA, you're in the DOD, you're pretty much, your life is about deception and lying and pulling things over on people. I mean, that's kind of what
Well,
they do.
Well, I'm not. I think you have to separate. I mean, the CIA is one thing. The CIA is, espionage and counter espionage.
Right.
The DoD, there are elements in the DoD that do that. But I mean, the Department of Defense, there's a lot of just, straight up, um,
Okay, yeah.
you
Yeah,
know,
you're right.
yeah. So again, when we talk about let's just talk about the object in that video. Okay, maybe that's ours. Okay, maybe.
Maybe.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, it
but
could be saying anomalous as well. I'm not saying it's not. I'm
Mhm.
just
Right,
saying
right,
that
right,
it's also a possibility.
right. But let's say it's ours. Let's say it's ours, and that this is some sort of ruse to somehow, I don't know, convince other governments that either we do have that kind of technology, which is one way you could think of it,
Mhm.
or that we don't when we really do. Okay.
Right.
So, there could be several levels of deception going on. Um, I'm not sure this would be the best way to do that. First of all, we know, because we study this, we know that there are reports and of objects that do things that are probably beyond even our secret technology. A lot of people talk about the breakaway space program and all that stuff. I find
Mhm.
most of that kind of nonsense. Um, and I just don't see any evidence of it. But sure, we probably have stuff that's a couple generations beyond what we publicly acknowledge. But we know that there are things that break probably, even the boundaries of what we could do, unless there is some really super secret group somewhere that's got, you know technology that would blow all of our minds, and that's certainly possible. I tend to think that we probably have stuff that's pretty good, but we don't have things that can, the kind of crafts that would totally crush a human being at the speeds that it suddenly accelerates. Things that can just stop on a dime and drop like some of, like the
Well,
reports that we've
so
heard for years and years and years. And we've heard these reports, back into the 40s and 50s,
well, yeah, absolutely.
So I don't know. It's certainly possible, and I think you're absolutely right for for suggesting that we think about it. I think we do need to pursue all sorts of avenues here. Um, I'm I'm taking a wait and see. Um,
I suggest everyone should take up wait and see.
yeah, absolutely. The only thing I would say is that the one thing I think we can be pretty conclusive about is that the tenor of the coverage has changed. I think something happened to 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 make that the tenor of the respectable media coverage of this change. And what made that happen, I think, is really going to be a big piece of figuring out what is really going on. And if this is a drip of disclosure, that small d disclosure, and it feels like it might be to me, I think we're going to see a few more drips. Already, it started with just the the basically the story about the program in the New York Times. Now we're getting more stories from very unimpeachable pilots who've seen these things are now talking about it. What I expect to see, and I'll sort of make a prediction, is that we're going to see more of these little drips. And I think what the one thing, if nothing else, that this little episode has accomplished is it's going to make people feel more comfortable talking about it openly and not fearing that ridicule. And I've seen a real the usual skeptics seem to be hanging kind of low right now. And like I said, watching Neil deGrasse Tyson sort of stumble around and say, "Well, it's unknown." Yeah, we know it's
Yeah,
know it's
yeah,
unknown, but he wasn't coming out and saying, "Oh, this is a temperature inversion," or "That's a
right.
flock of birds," or anything like that. It's pretty hard, even as someone who's a knee jerk, you know, ridicule spewer when it comes to this subject, to look at footage and hear guys in fighter planes saying, "Oh my God, what is that thing?"
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and to address the stories of these squadrons being sent out to intercept these things and watching them drop from 80,000 feet down towards the water, and these things are hovering and the water's churning, and there are no wings, there are no rotors. These are pretty the examples that have been put out there are pretty hard to just wave away. But we're used to seeing incredible stories like that being waved away.
Yes.
The classic is Phil Klass saying that the 1976 Tehran incident where fighters were scrambled and we had ground observers looking at these things and pilots locking on to these things and they're whizzing around their airplanes in impossible ways. And Phil Klass says, well, that was actually Jupiter.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what we're used to. I mean, that's if the respectable media covered it at all, that's the kind of crap that we're so used to.
Yes.
And suddenly we're not getting that.
Well,
Suddenly it's being treated as if it's real.
I would say the other exception recently has been the Chicago airport one,
Mm-hmm.
which wasn't as
Yes,
dismissed as easily because of the witnesses, because so many people saw it, and it certainly wasn't easy to explain.
exactly. And even then people were saying, oh, is this disclosure, and I think and before that, we've had some stories that were covered, but really since like Jerry said, it's been since the 1970s that we've had the real mainstream people the mainstream reporters, the mainstream outlets actually talking about this without the snark and without the ridicule and without the derision and the mockery. And that's really my big, I think a
That's
lot
your
of
big
people don't,
takeaway.
yeah, I think people don't get that. Maybe because a lot of us, like I'm a kind of an old guy, so there was no internet when I was a kid. I had to read the newspapers, up until when I was in college. There was no internet, there were no podcast or YouTube or anything. You read the paper and you watched the nightly news, and and that's how you found out what was going on in the world. You read books and journals and stuff like that, but really it was the newspapers and the few networks that were on TV. And so I've that's how I first started, encountering this stuff, and it was just not discussed for at least since the 1970s. The mainstream does not touch this without joking,
Yeah.
or is a total debunker pieces. So that is my big takeaway. That's why I had that shocked moment when I sort of came to my senses, sitting listening to that NPR show and thinking they're not making fun of this. They're talking about it on in the first place. They're
Yeah.
talking about it. And not only are they talking about it, they're bringing people on and they're asking questions, and they're not making fun of the people that they're bringing on to talk about it. You know, it's it's a different world. I mean, something changed. Where that's going to go, it's undeniably different right now. And when I felt that, I, I was in a bit of shock. I'm still in a bit of shock over this, and that may wear off, and it may wind up being nothing. But I really suspect that there's some discussion going on at certain levels, that we're gonna talk about this seriously.
Well, that would be awesome.
Yeah,
Um, and I
where they're
think,
just pulling our leg.
yeah, it may
But
it,
I
it may
really don't
it may
think.
just disappear and all turn back to to the stars asking for money
Mm.
again.
Right. As much as I used, Tom, as a whipping boy in the past, this whole, ever since he started his campaign of "I've got the secrets," and boy, are you guys gonna freak out when I tell you all the top level people I'm talking to. I mean, and his, the money pledged to build a starship and crap like that. I mean, I have been vociferously critical, of that whole endeavor. But I gotta say, I maybe, well, one thing though. I mean, you notice he wasn't mentioned that
No,
much,
it
at
wasn't
all.
mentioned at all.
Yeah, so I think he may have played the useful idiot kind of role, sort of a popular mouthpiece. And now that people like Harry Reid are stepping up and saying, "Yeah, this is real, and that's why I got money for it." And
But
I
not
think,
very much money.
right, yeah, well, no, it's not much money, but the fact that there was a program, for years, the government has said, no, we don't study this
Yeah.
anymore. We know they do.
Yeah, exactly. And then they're
Yeah,
still studying it. This is just one of probably many programs. This was
exactly.
this was basically just money given to Bigelow is what this was.
Yeah, yeah, and Bigelow's doing some really interesting stuff. He's building these inflatable modules and things like that. I
Mhm.
mean, I know I have a, a friend, whose wife was actually out there working, with him on this stuff. I can't wait to talk to her a little more closely about her experiences. But it's it is a little bit of money, but we know the government has been all over this, so they have to be.
Oh yeah.
And a friend of mine, was telling me, his UFO sighting was one of those, and you hear about these all the time, where it was like a diamond shaped object, and right behind it were two fighter jets
Right.
following it. And how many times have you heard those stories? Yes. So we know it's happening. We know that's happening. We know the government is involved. and again, if you look at how people have said disclosure might unfold, it's exactly what's happening here is a little bit. You give a little bit. You don't have the president come out and make an announcement at the UN and freak everyone out. You do it a little bit at a time. And before you know it, the tenor of the conversation has changed. More people are able to talk about it openly without fear of ridicule. And then you release a little bit more. And I think it was Red Pill Junkie was on Twitter was saying something about, well, what about the high strangeness and the Oz factor and the psychic elements and all that? Well, put yourself in the shoes of Joe,
Oh
Joe
yeah, yeah,
Disclosure in the Pentagon. You're not going to come out and start talking about that stuff. I mean, it's weird enough to say that there are objects flying around and we don't know what they are. Maybe we do, but the party line is we don't know what they are. You're not going to also come out and say, they've been they're probably transdimensional and you can encounter them in your bedroom at night and they might stick a probe up your butt and or even to say that they can have psychic components and if you have encounters with them. So what, if I was Mr. Joe Disclosure in the Pentagon and it was my job to sort of start releasing this stuff and start trying to get it taken seriously, to let some of it out, to declassify some of it. It's exactly how I would do it. I would do it a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then eventually people just people don't care, and and they're just more worried about who's going to win on The Bachelor or something like that. And maybe that's what you want. Maybe you want people to be a little desensitized. So when you do say, "All right, we've been studying this stuff for a long time. It's really weird.
yeah.
uh, we still don't really know what's going on, or conversely, we know what's going on, and here's what it is." That you don't hammer them with something and have the people freaking out in the streets scenario. You just you dribble it out, and before you know it, it's just common wisdom.
The couple of things that occurred to me, and then I'm going to let you go because I know you didn't want to do a super long show, and we've been talking for almost an hour. Um,
Good, it's been great, man.
one, Tom DeLonge, of course, came out saying we know everything, and then this report came out saying we basically don't know anything. Um, which is, it's funny because they threw 4.4 million into this for 5 years and came back with we don't know what they are, but they're real, and it's like ufologists have been saying, well, we don't. Well, some of course think they know what they are, but some of some of us have been sitting here saying, well, we don't know what they are, but they're real, and we didn't throw $4.4 million at them.
Right.
Um, the other thing is, this could also be if maybe they do know a lot more than they're saying,
Mm-hmm.
but they want to shift the conversation away from what it really is towards
Mm-hmm.
something else.
Right.
Maybe they don't. Maybe Tom DeLonge's right, and whatever's going on is not pleasant. So they kind of want to shift it away to don't worry about this. Look at this over here.
Mm-hmm.
Not that
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
not that I think Tom DeLonge is being fed any massive amount of real information. I think he's being fed some.
Mm-hmm.
I don't doubt the things he says. Like it's not
Mm-hmm.
that I think Tom DeLonge's lying when he says he's talked to all these people. I
Mm-hmm.
just doubt the veracity of their information because we've seen it before. We've seen that type of play before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have, but we've also seen people attempt to be truthful as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's you know, I think the only approach we can take right now
Wait
is
and
to
see.
just kind of note what's happening, with that, and try to keep our own biases out of it as much as we can. That the Fortean approach of just following the data here. There's all kinds of possibilities, and I think a lot of us just because we've been in this so long, we want to reject the possibility that it's exactly what it is at its face value. Um, you know, it's like, you kind of get what you want, and then you realize you or you feel like you don't really want it. Um, and it's an understandable psychological reaction because all of us have been, we've been through this giant cosmic meat grinder that is ufology, and we've had our brains pretty much scrambled and extruded into um, because it is such a weird subject. And I think all of us have gone back and forth on either the ETH or anti-ETH, or it's just a real, it I forget the word that Red Pill Junkie used today because my brain's a little fogged. But it's a subject that is very trickstery, as we know. George Hansen said it spectacularly well in his book on
Yes.
the trickster and the paranormal. Um, so a lot of us we've just been through a lot in our lives trying to understand this, and looking at different views and things like that. And I think it's kind of terrifying. It's kind of ontologically terrifying. I know it is to me, um, to imagine that possibly that that the government and other you know powers that be will come clean about it, and then it's not just our little thing anymore. Then it's real. And what happens then? What happens if it is acknowledged that this thing is real, and we start talking about it as a society, uh, seriously? What the hell happens? I have no freaking clue, man.
Well, I guess we shall see one way or the other.
Yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to revisit this on a panel show, like in maybe a year.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
we should kind of all look back and go, look at what we were thinking, and how we were reacting and stuff like that. I mean, I have no doubt it will be whichever way it goes, it will be something unexpected. Whether it turns out to be a blip and then it all goes away, or whether it really is like the first drip in a larger, a larger sort of big D disclosure, or something somewhere in between. But
Yeah.
it's exciting. It's I haven't seen this much, you know, this much kind of excitement, both and sorts, all sorts of emotional and reactions in this field in a long time. And I
True.
certainly haven't seen. I know your anecdotal survey. You said a lot of people didn't know about it, but I've talked to people who also are not big aficionados of the subject, and it's definitely being talked about out there. So we'll see, man. It's interesting. It's definitely, it's 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 not. It may not be huge in the long run, but right now the change in tone is a really big thing, and I think we got to watch that really closely and see where it goes.
I would agree with you on that. The tone is probably the biggest thing out of this because
Yeah. Yep.
everything else we either already knew, suspected, and they didn't really present proof. I mean, like Red Pill was really focused on them having the warehouse full of stuff that's been collected
Hmm.
from, but they didn't go into any details about what the stuff was, whether or not it
Right.
was confirmed anomalous. They just said, they had this warehouse of stuff. And it's kind of like, well, you kind of said something without saying anything.
Hmm.
And
Well,
and
well.
again, that's where my radar goes off, and it's like
Mhm.
you just literally told us nothing other than you have some stuff that may have been recovered from these things, and we've had that. We've had everything from pancakes to slag, you
Right.
know.
Right. But here's what I would say to that is the New York Times does not write speculative stories like that.
Oh no, I'm sure they
So,
do.
right, no, no,
That's
no,
yeah.
no. So what I mean is that if a reporter wrote that, they're not just, and it wasn't written just as a quote from Bigelow. It was written as this is objectively real. It wasn't just like Bigelow says he has this. It was written as, and I'll go back and look at the language in a number of the stories, but it's written very clearly as if there are these alloys and that they are studying physical effects on people. And in order for a reporter at the New York Times, I know journalists have talked to journalists, in order for someone to write that, the editor would have cut that completely if the reporter didn't say, okay, here's why I'm stating this. So my guess is, and this is often done this way, is that this is a story that is probably has some bigger components, and they're holding on to some of it just to keep the story alive and going. And so, that's what having studied, I read the Times, I read the Post. Have this is They don't just write stuff like that. I mean, that's like coast to coast journalism.
Okay, well, what the actual quote is, I just
Hmm.
pulled it up. Under Mr. Bigelow's direction, the company modified buildings in Las Vegas for the storage of metal alloys and other materials that Mr. Elizondo and program contractors said had been
Hmm.
recovered from unidentified aerial phenomena.
Hmm.
So that right there doesn't really
Okay.
tell us much. We have to take Elizondo's word that these have been recovered from and we know stuff comes out of these things. There are physical traces.
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah. Yeah.
We know this. This is not new to us.
Hmm.
Researchers also studied people who said they'd experienced physical effects from encounters with the objects and examined them for any physiological changes.
Hmm.
Again, not new. We know that people who have these experiences, going all the way back to Kenneth Ring's work, where he, compared it to the after effects of a near death experience.
Right. We know that.
Right.
We know that because we are who we are, and we
Right, but
immerse
what I'm
ourselves.
saying is they're not saying anything that's really questionable there, but they're not giving us anything new. So when I look at it, I go, well, yeah, you're telling us a lot of stuff that we already know. You're kind of confirming the things we already know, but you didn't give like people. That sounds exciting to people, but we have all that already. You know?
No, we do. We
Yeah,
do.
that's what I'm
You and I
saying. Yes,
do
yes.
because we read a lot of sources. The people reading this who are mainstream consumers of mainstream news do not know this. Not only that, it's never been it wouldn't have even passed an editor's desk if there was not something else happening in the background, some kind of corroboration, that the journalists have a little deeper access to this than they're
Not,
letting
not,
out in this
not
particular.
necessarily. I mean, because they're basically just saying Elizano said this.
Hmm. Yeah, but again, there's a difference between stories that come out again, and they quote respectable media, the way they're vetted, that those quotes would not have come out, would not have been, the editor would have said, we can't put this in here. This is hearsay. This is nonsense. You got to make sure you know that this is really happening. And you know, it, it is that's the change in tone that I'm talking about. The New York Times is not going to write something that someone's is going to turn around and put them up for utter ridicule.
Right, right.
So there's something, the journalists who are writing this stuff, and Leslie Kane is one of them. So they would you know they would not let Leslie just get on the front page of the New York Times and start talking about silly stuff that was absolutely not true. So there's something. Yeah, I mean, you are correct that these are quotes attributed to people, but I don't think it would have made it into that article if it was just, oh, this guy said this silly thing.
Right, but
You know.
my point is not that it's inaccurate. I'm sure it's
Mhm,
accurate. I'm sure he has these places, and I'm sure he has materials.
mhm.
But it's not like they came out and said they have a craft, or
Right, yeah,
hey, we've been studying the Roswell wreckage. That really was an unidentified flying
yeah,
object.
yeah.
None of these big reveals. These are like little pieces just to kind of tease. Like
Mhm.
they said something that sounded like, ooh, that's really interesting, until you actually look at UFO history and realize we've had stuff from these things for as long as they've been seen, going back
But it has
throughout history.
never,
But
never,
officially, yes, I understand
never
that part.
officially,
I'm
right,
not arguing that. I'm just saying, like, it sounds more interesting than it actually is when you know the history.
right, because
So
we know the history.
the
The
reason,
average person on the street
yes,
doesn't know the
no,
history.
I'm agreeing with you on that. I'm
Yeah,
agreeing. It's
yeah,
just
yeah.
I'm just saying the reason I'm kind of meh on this is because they told us a lot of stuff that we already knew, and it was kind of like, here's this. You posted it Saturday night, and I went to do my radio show, and I said, okay, I'll look at that when I get home. And then I got home and I saw Peter Levinda like freaking out about it,
Mhm.
and I was like, I really should read this article that Mike sent. And so I read it and went, that was it. That's all you gave us, and that's why everyone's freaking out.
But that's because you're Soraya.
No, yeah,
You
I
know,
realize that. I realize that, but I'm not debating with you that the coverage and the way it's going to affect other people is different. But
Mhm.
like, I feel like it was a lot of stuff that was kind of puffed up, but when you really look into it, there was nothing really substantial there.
The admission is
Other than the admission and the way that the media is changing, treating it.
yes, yes, and the admission, just the admission that these things are real, with no really pushback against it in the articles that are coming out. I mean, that is that is a game changer. That is massively. That's like a 180-degree turn. So something, and yeah, no, we know this stuff. We know it because we live it, we read it, we talk about it, we talk about it with each other, we speculate about it. We've spent decades, some of us, immersed in this stuff. Yeah, so it's not going to be exciting reveals. It's not, you know, it's not incredible footage of a craft that's, solid and it's rotating and it's got lights and it's shooting off. And, it's not the mind blowing stuff that we would love to that would fascinate us and that would excite us because we've seen so much footage. We've seen, better footage than was released
Yes.
to the times. um, so we're not going to get that. Maybe they have that. They're not going to put that out at first. And again, I think this totally confirms the idea that people have been talking about for a long time, that if you're going to acclimate the public to the reality, and start talking about it seriously, you're not going to throw the crazy stuff out first. You're going to put little pieces here and there.
Well, I'll tell you,
Yeah.
after talking to you about it, I'm a little more curious where it's going to go than I was before we had this conversation.
Mhm. Well,
So
talking to you guys has made me, a little more skeptical. So I think we're working as we usually do, is like a good sounding boards off of each other. And it's I I was, again, my feeling was shock, and I'm not normally a person that's easily shocked. Um, and about, especially when it comes to this subject, I'm as jaded as anyone at this point. I'm cynical, especially when it comes to video footage.
yeah,
Uh, I'm skeptical of the government's you know motives in doing things, and I was shocked. And it took me a while to sit back and figure out why I was shocked and how I was processing this. And that freaking NPR show, man, I'm just listening to it, I'm going, when's the joke coming?
right.
Okay. When's when's the skeptic coming on to just, to tear this to pieces? When is the host going to start laughing? When is he going to say, well, I guess we'll have to keep watching the skies, just that. And it didn't come. And then they had a folklorist talking, about the cultural implications of this. And no one's laughing and no one's joking and no one's mocking anyone. And there's no derision or condescension or suggestion that this is all silliness.
Well, let's hope
That's
it
when I
keeps up.
realized,
Yeah.
man, what the hell has just happened? And that's when I sat back and I went back and started looking. I'm like, I was just too kind of shocked to really put my finger on what was going on. And something's up, no matter what it eventually, unspools as something's up.
Someone, and this is a perfect end to this. Someone just sent me a meme that says 2017 has been so surreal that the Pentagon basically confirmed the existence of UFOs, and we barely reacted to it.
I saw somebody wrote it was something similar. It was like, yes, the government announces UFOs are real, and all anyone's talking about is the animatronic Trump.
Yes, yeah.
In the world of tomorrow. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, maybe the simulation has gone haywire, and they'll just do a hard reboot, and we'll all start over at level 1 characters again or something.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for spending some time with us, Mike.
Yeah, man. Thank you for allowing me to talk about this because it's just been, I've been trying to sort of write it all down, and it was really helpful to just have this discussion, and especially after going back and forth with the usual roundtable folks, and seeing everybody's kind of differing responses and everything. It was really good to just be able to sit and kind of blather on about it to try to figure out what's going on here.
And where can people find your writings and such?
Yeah, well, in all the usual places, social media wise. Also, Michael M. Hughes is my website, and I've got a mailing list.
.com?
MichaelMHughes.com. Yeah,
Okay.
just Google my name, Michael M. Hughes, and you'll get all kinds of crazy stuff from me. So, yep. And of course, on Where Did the Road Go roundtables.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, man. Looking forward to revisiting this.
Yes. And a special thanks to our Patreons who are pledging at the $10 or above level. Roland Belstedt, John Eddy, Chris Elmquist, and I'm probably going to massacre this next one, and I apologize. Feel free to send me the correct pronunciation. A.E. Gaia Quinta, Alfred Tuttle, Carla Mahoney, and Gabriel Zero. Thank you very much. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.